Hey everyone, and welcome to the Joomla Shack conference. I'm delighted to welcome Andy Miller to talk with us. Sometimes when you do these conferences, they are 20, 25 sessions long, and even though you don't plan it, you end up with a through line, with a common thread that keeps on popping up. And in 2018, it might be one technology. In 2019, maybe another technology. And this year in 2020, it's definitely been Tailwind. It has popped up in multiple presentations and people have been raving about it. And so I think it's entirely appropriate that our last presentation of the conference is Andy, who is one of the most talented and innovative developers that we have speaking. And he's going to talk to us about Tailwind and why he's fallen in love with it. Andy, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so I want to get started with this. I know we only have a short amount of time, and I have a lot of information to cover here. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind to go through, so just sort of try and stick with it, and then we'll have questions at the end, and I will be glad to answer those then. So first of all, who am I, if you don't know who I am? I'm a co-founder of Joomla. I'm also the CEO of Rocket Theme, and I'm the author of Grav CMS, and I am a passionate open source advocate. So let's get right into it, okay? So I'm going to see what is Tailwind CSS. So it's utility first CSS framework, and it's packed with classes that you basically put together to create any design. And you do this directly in your markup. So rather than traditionally doing it in a CSS file where you're providing all your style and then your HTML where you're doing the actual markup and you're trying to manage, those two separate places, it's all managed in one place. So compared to most of the more traditional CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, Foundation, Semantic UI, you don't have to worry about keeping those things separate. The HTML and the CSS actually live together in this one place. So the reason for this whole framework, I think, it's kind of a result of the frustration of using these traditional CSS frameworks, which seem great at the beginning, and you follow a bunch of best practices to try to keep your CSS organized. But no matter how hard you try, this always breaks down. You may keep it together all the way through the project development stage, and then you hand it off to your client, and you may be really proud of that CSS. But then after you've got a few requests from your client about some new functionality or some quite radical changes, and you don't have a lot of time, that structure that you've built just goes out of the window, and you end up just sort of making rough changes here and there, and your beautiful structure is all lost. And it basically means that now your CSS is no longer manageable. So here's a good quote that I liked. After finally getting to use Tailwind CSS on a real client project in the last 2 weeks, I never want to write CSS by hand again. I was a skeptic, but the hype is real. And this is exactly how I feel. I was a little skeptical at first. It didn't seem right. But after you've done it for a while, you just can't imagine going back to the old way of having a separate a bunch of CSS files and trying to manage those. So here's a really quick example of what we're talking about. So in the first section, you can see just a real short snippet of HTML when you've got this paragraph tag and you've got this blue text class assigned to it. And then in your CSS file somewhere, you've got a blue text CSS rule where you're setting a color and a font size. But in Tailwind CSS, this just becomes a P tag in your HTML with a class of text-blue-500 to give it a blue color. And the 500 is like a scale from 0 to 1,000. So 500 is right in the middle of this blue scale. So it's kind of like a bright blue. And then text large. And that's all you have to do. Everything else is just handled for you. Almost every CSS selector is available, and you just use it by this semantic naming. And what you'll find is that these names are so much more clear than traditional CSS names that you'll forget the CSS names and you'll just remember the Tailwind ones because they just make so much more sense. And you'll end up being able to write CSS a lot quicker and with less errors because you're just writing them without constantly having to refer to documentation or Stack Overflow or whatever you use, because it just makes sense. And if it's not in there, then there's probably a plugin available, which is really cool. So I'm just going to show you some quick sample sites of sites that use Tailwind. And just really the important takeaway here is that there's nothing that really defines these sites as using Tailwind. That's the whole point. Tailwind is not an opinionated CSS framework. It doesn't have like a default style like Bootstrap or Material or one of these other ones have. So you don't have that lingering look of the framework underneath it. So these are just some random ones I found. This plausible one is quite nice. This Bud Agency is really different. Laravel uses a lot of Tailwind. All of the Laravel sites are pretty much built with Tailwind. So I just grabbed Spark here because I like the colors of it. This is a site that we did with Tailwind, and this Web Artisan site, another nice little site. So how do you start using Tailwind? It's going to get a little bit technical here. You don't have to worry too much about all this stuff. If I'll have the slides available and you can see them there, or you can check the documentation. A lot of this is there. So Tailwind is actually built on top of Post CSS, and Post CSS is available as a node package. So the first thing you want to do is install Node.js if you don't already have it. It's really easy. There's packages available for every platform. So just to go to the package manager section of the Node.js download page, because I like using package managers, and install it. And then after that, we're going to create a quick folder called tailwind-demo, and then we change into that folder. And the first thing we do is run npm init-y. This will create a package.json file. Then we want to install Tailwind itself and some other useful things. So npm install Tailwind CSS, Post CSS CLI, and auto prefixer. Auto prefixer is important because it basically means it's actually used by Tailwind, but what it's doing under the covers is it's basically making all of those browser-specific prefix versions of the CSS, so you don't have to worry about any of that. The next step is to create a base styles.css file, and in this example, you can see it's using this Tailwind command to basically load the base components and utilities parts of Tailwind. And step 7 is to create this tailwind config.js file with this command npx tailwind css init. That creates this really basic file, which we'll use later. Step 8 is to create the post CSS config.js, and there's no command for this, but it's just really a simple file with this, 6 lines of code in it, and a comment. This basically tells post CSS to use tailwind CSS and the auto prefixer. And then step 9 is to add a command into the package.json file for building the CSS. So I just call this command build, and you can see the command is basically post CSS, and there's a CSS styles.css, and that's the file we just created. And then the output file is going to be in build/styles.css. And then to test this all out, we run this command npm run build, and that will do all its work, and it will generate a build/styles.css, which we can now use. So the next step is to actually just create an HTML file. And here's just a really short, simple example. The important line is that link tag where we are linking and pointing to the build/styles.css file that we just built. And then inside of the body tag, we've actually got some Tailwind classes. You don't have to worry about exactly what these are right now, but if you just read them, they'll probably make sense to you. So there's a BG gradient 2B. So that's going to be a background gradient to a bottom. And then from yellow 600, so that's like a medium yellow to red 600. So like a medium yellow to a medium red gradient to a bottom. And then inside of that, we have a div, which is a flex box div. And then it's got the height of the screen and justify center and item center. So that means horizontally centered and vertically centered. So it's going to center the items inside of this div. So then we have an H1 tag for a header, and we give it a size of 6XL, font bold, and text white. So in your mind, you probably have an idea of how this is going to look. And hopefully that's what you envisioned, because that's basically exactly what we told it to do. So no CSS was involved. We were just using Tailwind classes. So important thing to note about base styling. So throughout Tailwind CSS, there is basically no styling applied to any HTML tag. So even an H1 tag or a list tag have very little styling on them, if any styling at all, which most do not have any. And then you basically have to apply classes. So it's useful to apply base classes, like common things across the board from your HTML at a high level. So perhaps in the HTML tag or the body tag, you can set something like text gray 900 and leading tight. So what that basically means is that your default color for your text is going to be gray 900 unless you specify otherwise on a specific tag or a specific section, a div or whatever. And then leading tight is your line height. And tight just means it's going to be pretty close together, not too far spread out. So that's just a way you can sort of set some of these things one time at a high level, and you'll just have comfort that anytime you use an H tag, a P tag, or whatever it is that has text in it, it will be gray 900 by default unless you specify something else. So a quick word about CSS variants, and they're used quite a lot, so I'm going to mention it quite early. Throughout Tailwind, there are scenarios where you need to change things for certain states. So there are these variants set up, and there's a lot of them, but some of the more common ones are hover, focus, active, disabled, the responsive variants, and dark. So how you use these is a very simple example here with a button. So we've got this button and it's got a border, it's got some padding, and it's rounded. And by default, it's got text blue 500, so it's blue text, and BG white. So it's a white button with blue text. But on hover, with this hover colon, text should be white and the background should be blue. So that's all you have to do to set up a hover state on your button. And you can also stack these up. So this LG colon hover, that's actually a breakpoint. So it's saying at the large breakpoint and hover, the background should be white. So you can stack them too, which is pretty powerful. So about mobile first. Tailwind is a mobile first framework, like most modern CSS frameworks are now, Bootstrap included. So what that means is that the default is the mobile size, and you can make modifications based on breakpoints for the larger sizes. And in Tailwind, there are 5 default breakpoints: small, medium, large, extra large, and 2XL. And how you use these are shown below. So in this example, we've got a BG TO500. That will be the background for all devices starting from the smallest device from a mobile phone on up. But then it says for the medium size breakpoint, switch to a background red of 500. But then at the large size breakpoint, switch back to the BG TO500. And then inside of that, the same for this other tag, we've got width 16, but in medium, I want the width to be 32, and large, the width to be 48. So they're all prefixed by these breakpoint prefixes. This is all completely customizable. So if you do want to use completely different breakpoints, perhaps you're much more comfortable using more traditional 3-point breakpoints with tablet, laptop, and desktop, you can edit your Tailwind config.js, and you can just put in under this theme screen section the definition and the sizes for these breakpoints. And once you do this and you recompile, instead of those MD colon, you use tablet colon, laptop colon. So you just change it this one place, it'll just work throughout. So I just wanted to mention that the Tailwind CSS comes with pretty much every CSS that you will need. And it seems like in each major release, they add more functionality. So in the version 2.0 that just came out a couple of weeks ago, it now has CSS grids and gradients added. I think transforms came in maybe like 1.8 or something like that. But they're all slowly coming in. And here's an example of how a CSS grid layout could look. And CSS grids are notoriously complex. And this sort of syntax just makes it much easier to visually see how this will lay out. Dark mode, and we've talked about this before the session, but dark mode was added in Tailwind 2.0. Prior to that, it was a plugin, and the syntax did change a little bit when it became an official part. And it has 2 major modes. It's got this media mode, which is effectively an automatic switching based on your system configuration. So if you have your system set to dark mode and you have your Tailwind set up to media, it will automatically use dark mode if that's what your system is set to. Or you can set it to class mode, which is like a manual mode. So just to show you how to implement a dark mode with the automatic switching inside your Tailwind config.js, you would set inside of the exports, you would set dark mode to media. And then when you use some HTML to actually style it with the dark mode, you use this dark colon prefix. So you can see here that this div and paragraph for the regular mode, the div has a background of gray, and the paragraph has, it's a gray 100. So it's a very light gray. It's almost white. And then the paragraph tag has a darker gray for its text. So it's a dark text on a light background. But for dark mode, it's got a gray 800. So a dark gray, and the text is a light gray. So it's a light on dark. And so that's all it is. It just uses another prefix, just like all the rest of Tailwind does. And for manual dark mode, it's really very similar, except you set the dark mode to class. And then inside your HTML, you would put a class somewhere above that would specify dark. And this is particularly useful if you want to have the user be able to select a light or dark mode, because then you can just use a little bit of JS and you just could toggle that class from dark to a blank effectively, and it'll switch on and off between dark mode and light mode, which is pretty neat. The next thing I want to mention is about reusable components. So components are something that people that use templating languages are very familiar with. And it's by basically what you do is you break up your HTML rendering into little chunks of templates, and then you just include those. And this is a really good way to avoid the potential of having repetitive HTML with a bunch of repeated classes throughout your design or your site. This is a popular technique for things like cards. So if you have a common styling for a card, you might break that up into a sub template, and that would contain your HTML and all the Tailwind CSS class styling for how that card should look. So in this example, actually, though, I use a title block, which is something that I used in a project recently, where the title was quite distinctive. It had some HTML and some CSS that needed to be applied. And that title was used throughout the website. It was used a lot in a single page with different modular type subpages. And also it was used on other pages and just in random places. And I didn't want to have to maintain that throughout all the HTML. So I just created this partials title.html.twig. And I just use this data.title and data.subtitle. So it's expecting a data object to be passed in, and this is using Twig. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Twig, but it's used in GraphCMS and Drupal and a lot of other places. So it's expecting this a data object to be passed in, and that data object should have a title and a subtitle, or an optional subtitle actually. So here you can see how I would use that. I create a variable with a title and a subtitle, and then I include the partial and I pass in the variable as data. So then anytime I need to, I can just use that same partial. Let's talk a little bit about customizing Tailwind. So Tailwind is extremely customizable and in a number of ways. So the first way is probably that you will customize it is by adding your own CSS. And just because Tailwind is a utility-first framework, it doesn't mean you can't use your own CSS. It's just not recommended. And basically, you should only use it when you absolutely need to. And there are definitely scenarios where you'll need to. There are things that are difficult to do in Tailwind, some advanced stuff with pseudos and things like that. And then if you need to do that, then you can just use CSS. And it's not a bad thing. It's just not ideal. Okay, so the first approach is just by editing your styles.css that you already created and putting in some CSS rule. And if you are going to do this, the recommendation is to use the Tailwind apply tag and actually apply class names as you would have done in your HTML, but you don't have to do that. You can actually just use regular CSS in that too. The next approach is to include another CSS file. So use the import tag, as I've done here, and we're importing a custom/site CSS file. And here is an example, the same example as before, where I have a button definition where I'm applying some padding, a background color, a text color of white, and it to be rounded. And then how you would use this is just as you would expect. Inside of your HTML, you would just have class reference to this button, but I'm also using some Tailwind-specific hover variants here to set the background to be blue 700 and the shadow, a drop shadow, a medium drop shadow to be applied. So you can mix and match the custom classes that you've done and the Tailwind classes too. And then like the last scenario is if you want to use custom CSS just with regular CSS. An example here is because Tailwind by default doesn't have CSS columns support. If you need to have a 3-column layout, it's just easy just to create a .3-columns class and say column count 3. And then you can just use that when you need it. So aside from customizing, you can also extend Tailwind. And the most popular way of extending Tailwind is via plugins. So here are 3 examples of plugins that I commonly use. The first 2, the Tailwind CSS / typography and the Tailwind CSS / forms. These are provided by the Tailwind CSS team, and they are first-class citizen type plugins. So they are well supported. And the typography provides some basic typography, and the forms provide some basic styling for forms. When I say basic, I mean basic. You're expected to extend it, but at least it doesn't look different from platform to platform. And the last one is the Tailwind CSS Debug Screens plugin. I find this particularly useful because it displays a little flag at the bottom of your browser to tell you what responsive mode you're in. So depending on the width of your browser, it could be like a small, medium, large, extra large, 2XL. So those breakpoints. And if you've done custom ones, it'll show those custom breakpoints too. So that's really useful for working on and debugging mobile layouts. So just the process to install a plugin is, again, just using npm. So it's just npm install and the name of the plugin, the full name. So it's at Tailwind CSS / typography for this example. And then once it's installed, you have to reference it inside your Tailwind config.js in the plugin section. So you just add a require, and that will then have the plugin available. And then like before, you need to recompile your CSS with that npm run build command to rebuild the CSS to make sure it has now all the typography classes that are part of this plugin. And just an example of how to use this Tailwind CSS typography plugin, for example, it is important, especially inside of Grav CMS, where we use Markdown a lot. So if your content does not have the ability to be easily editable to put in classes, and this is probably content in any CMS platform, you want to be able to provide some basic styling to those major tags. So things like, headers, paragraphs, lists, block quotes, all those standard type things that people use, it will apply some standard styling classes. And of course, this is all modifiable and customizable if you need to. Also, I did want to show this MD Prose LG. So aside from Prose, which is the main class for typography, there are some variations which are useful for larger breakpoints. So you might want to say, okay, the Prose size is fine for smaller devices, but as you get to larger devices, I want to use the Prose-LG sizes. So you're just using a breakpoint there. You can customize the default classes too. So here's an example where we're basically replacing the default Tailwind color palette with a custom color palette. So by default, Tailwind comes with a bunch of colors, and more often than not, your design or your client won't need a chunk of those colors, and they probably will need some other ones, a custom color that is specific to their brand, for example. So in this example here, we've got inside of the Tailwind config.js, we've got the theme color section, and we're defining the color palette to be gray with colors.trueGray. So in Tailwind 2.0, they introduced a bunch of different gray palette variants because the regular gray from previous versions of Tailwind was quite blue, had a strong blue hue. And a lot of people didn't like that. They wanted it to be a much more true gray that they were used to. So there are different variations. So here I'm saying use the true gray version of the gray palette, use the blue palette for blue and the red palette for red. And then I've introduced 2 new custom colors here called white and black, which are quite useful, but that's my entire palette. So then the other approach is to use extend. So for colors, for example, you can do theme extend colors. And here I'm setting a new color called primary, and I'm giving it a specific hex code for this blue color that I like. So it will have all the existing standard Tailwind colors available plus this extra primary. And this primary color will be available in all the standard places throughout Tailwind. So if you are setting text color, it would be text-primary. If you're setting background color, it would be BG-primary, and border color would be border-primary. So things like that. So it's automatically handled for you, all those different classes that are available based on colors. Another popular place to extend is in the spacing. So spacing is used for all of the standard spacing things like height, width, padding, and margin. So here I'm extending the standard spacing I'm not replacing, I'm extending it, and I'm adding a couple of extra spacing values, a 128 of 32 rem and a 144 of 36 rem. And you may have noticed that the way that spacing works inside of Tailwind is if you divide the value by 4, it's the number of rem. So 128 divided by 4, that would be 132 rem, and 144 is 36 rem. And we would just use these just like we normally would, padding, height, width classes. So here's an example, P-128, that'll be a padding of 32 rem, and an MT-144 will be a margin top of 36 rem. That's basically what it's translating to. So size is important, and this is especially important for Tailwind because the size of the CSS that you work with when you're developing is massive. The more functionality that is added to Tailwind, the more classes that has available, that means that that CSS grows and grows, and it compounds. So if you have a dark mode available, that compounds the size of the CSS file hugely, because it's basically making dark versions of a ton of those CSS class names, and some other things really add a lot of size too. Like if you have a bunch of size variants, that can add a lot of size, a lot of colors, that adds a lot of size, etc. So there are ways to optimize the file size. And I'm talking about the development CSS here. So the one that you use when you're developing your site. So the first way is to remove things that you don't necessarily need. The colors are a common place to start. So you can remove colors, if you don't have any chance that you're ever going to use pink, you might as well remove that color. Gradients are really cool, but if you don't plan on using them, you can remove the gradients because they do take up a lot of space. And if you need to remove gradients, for example, you can just put this syntax in your Tailwind config.js, and its gradient color stops false. And this is the common syntax to turn off core plugins with inside Tailwind. The documentation also has a good section on how to optimize, and it recommends some things that can take up a lot of space. The important and the most useful tool, though, that Tailwind provides is with Purge. This used to be a third-party thing that you would install as a plugin, but in recent versions of Tailwind, I think from 1.9, it's been built into Tailwind. So what Purge does is it basically, during the compile process, it runs through all of your HTML, all of your Markdown, and it looks for classes that you're using, and it only puts the classes that you're using in this production version of the CSS. So it's a highly optimized version of the CSS that only contains what the site needs. This is a radical departure from the traditional way of doing CSS when you're using Bootstrap or something like that, where you would normally have a fairly large Bootstrap CSS file, and then you would have all your custom CSS added on top. So you end up with a lot of CSS. With this approach, by purging out all the CSS you're not using, you end up with a highly optimized, very small CSS file. So how we configure this is really easy now. You just basically edit the Tailwind config.js file, and in the purge section, you put path locations to all the places that you want it to look for to scan those files and basically look for Tailwind class names. So for example, here we're going to be scanning all of the .html files, all the html.twig files, and all the view files if you have view. And obviously you tweak this and edit this. I commonly would be scanning things like YAML files, because in some of my configuration, I might be allowing people to specify class names, Tailwind class names, to control padding or height or something like that. So I want to be scanning those files too. So you can add as much as you want to this. So for that purge to work, you have to build for production. So to build for production with Tailwind, the way it works is it uses this node env environment variable, and that needs to be set to production. So the easiest way that I recommend to do this is to create a new build script. So in this case, below the build that we had originally, we've added a prod. So now we've got this prod script. And if you look at the syntax of it, it's post CSS styles -o. So outputting to build styles.prod.css. So a production version of CSS with this environment variable set to production. And to run this, it's just npm run prod. So instead of npm run build from before, it's npm run prod. And if you do this, you'll end up with a file. But before we do that, Did I skip a step? No. Before we do that, I would highly recommend using another class called CSS, another plugin called CSS Nano. And this actually compresses the final CSS. So it removes all the extra space or the extra tabs and comments and things like that. So it makes it even smaller. So to do this, we just need to install it, just like we've done some other plugins with npm install CSS Nano. And then in the post CSS config, below the Tailwind CSS and the auto prefixer lines we had previously, we had this process env line or 2 lines. And all that's doing is just basically saying if the production mode for the environment variable is set to production, to pass the CSS through CSS Nano. So that's it. So now when we run npm run prod, we go from a massive development CSS file of 3.9 megs to 4.6K for the demo that I just showed you. Granted, that was a tiny demo with that red gradient, but that just goes to show you that, it just added the CSS classes that it needed. And that's not even gzipped yet. So, but that's a massive difference. And obviously you can be looking at, I would say 40 to 50 KB for a full-size production website. That's about the amount of classes that you'll end up using, from my experience. So one of the last steps here is the building for development. So I skipped this at first, but when you're developing a Tailwind CSS site, you're probably going to be wanting to run your Tailwind stuff in this watch mode. So basically what this does is it basically hot reloads and rebuilds the CSS file, the development CSS file. If you make any changes to your Tailwind config.js, like to add custom stuff or, to tweak padding and things like that, and also if you add any custom CSS, it will detect those changes and it will rebuild the build style CSS file on the fly. So to do this, all you have to do is just add another script in the package.json file, and I've called it here watch. And it's effectively the same as the build, but it's just got a -- watch at the end. So if you run npm run watch, it'll just run and sit there waiting for any file changes. And as soon as there's a file change, it'll recompile. Really useful. And then really the last step here is I have a bunch of useful links here. The Tailwind community is fantastic. I didn't put on here, but there is actually a really good Discord chat for Tailwind. It's really active. There's a lot of people in there. So if you need help, it's a great place to go. But you'll spend your most time on tailwindcss.com because that is the resource for all the documentation. The documentation is really good. And pretty much everything that you need will be answered there. Tailwindui.com is a commercial package that the Tailwind team have put together of pre-built components. So it's like a component library. And that's something you can really leverage in Tailwind because of all the HTML and the CSS is together. All you have to do is take a chunk of a Tailwind component, copy and paste it, and it'll look exactly as you intend. Don't have to worry about copying the HTML and then somehow merging in the CSS or converting it to Sass if you're using Sass and rebuilding it. It's just really easy to sort of plug and play with these different components. Play.tailwindcss.com is like a live sandbox of being able to fiddle around with Tailwind CSS. That's actually pretty new and it's quite neat. And then there's a bunch of other companies have their own UI kits and templates and components, which are pretty cool. And then there's other tools that I've linked to here. For example, there's a typography playground where you can play with different Google fonts with the Tailwind typography plugin. There's a couple of tools in here where it lets you create your own custom color palettes, or if you need to tweak a color, it helps build out all those colors. And then lastly, there's a huge list on that github.com link of a huge list of Tailwind CSS resources. It's basically just got a ton of stuff to find out about Tailwind. So I know that was a whirlwind thing, and I apologize for going through it so quickly, but there's a lot of information, and I didn't want to not cover something and then you'll be like, well, I thought Tailwind could do this. And, so this is a really quick high level overview of the power and functionality of Tailwind. And I hope you have gained a bit of a high level view, at least, about what it can do and how it works and what a game changer it really is.
That was really awesome. Thanks, Andy.
You're welcome.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience here. We've got a question from Martin. We talked a little bit before about how you were using Tailwind with Grav. Have you tried to use Tailwind in Joomla templates? And if so, do you have any advice for someone that would want to do that?
To be honest, I have not. Pretty much all my attention these days is on a Grav, so I'm not really actively developing with Joomla. We've talked about it, but it's just kind of hard it's kind of hard on the Joomla side, because Bootstrap is such a kind of like an integrated framework for Joomla that breaking away from that is a little harder. Plugins and things like that you're going to use are going to expect Bootstrap. So
Grav is perhaps a little less opinionated than...
It's certainly less opinionated, and it has been since the start. To just give you like an idea, like there is no default framework for a Grav at all. No plugin actually provides any rendering, really. I mean, it provides like the HTML, but it doesn't really require anything, any framework. So it's all quite flexible.
Question from Paul. Does Tailwind have any advantages for someone that might be new to CSS and is ramping up? Is it the kind of tool that you would recommend that someone who's relatively new to CSS use to help them get started quickly?
I would actually say yes. CSS is inherently complicated, normally. I've been doing CSS for years and years and years, and I still find myself having to look up, the archaic, labeling for some of these CSS rules, and then to get a clear understanding of how they work. They're just not very obvious a lot of the time. And what Tailwind does, and I think what they've done really, really well in Tailwind is they've kept a consistent syntax across all of the classes. So things that would traditionally in CSS be quite convoluted and different are now unified. So it makes learning CSS a lot easier. Now, you will have to know how these things work. It's not like you can just ignore CSS completely. I mean, you do have to know, for example, Flexbox, what you're talking about with, flex start and flex end and the justify and all those sort of flex terminology. But once you have a high level understanding of it, matching up the Tailwind classes for those things is much easier than matching up the regular CSS names, because they're just more obvious and more consistent across the board. So I would recommend it. I mean, you still have to know CSS, but I wouldn't worry so much about remembering all the CSS semantics because they're not so important. And I think that's the thing that trips a lot of people up and turns a lot of people off CSS, to be sure.
Question from Reggie. Oh, not even a question, more like an exclamation. Wow, I really loved the information on the purge option. I'm really blown away by the file size difference.
Yeah, it's probably the thing that actually led me towards Tailwind in the first place. It's really frustrating, and it's really hard to do it yourself with traditional CSS frameworks to control the size of your NCSS. We were using Spectre CSS a lot prior to this, which is kind of a lightweight CSS framework, lighter weight than the traditional ones, Bootstrap, UIKit, etc. But it is opinionated, and they do have a way, because it's built in Sass, to actually turn off components. So you can say, oh, I don't need the cards view or the slideshow view, because it does have quite a lot of these little UI components. So you can turn all those off by just commenting them out, but that's up to you. You have to go through, and then as soon as you find yourself needing one, you have to remember to go back, turn it back on. You have to accept the file size. And then as you build more and more custom CSS, that file size increases because all your CSS is just adding to the top of the base framework. So you can't really do what Tailwind does. So, Tailwind can only do its purge because it knows about all the CSS classes, class names that it has in itself. And then it just simply looks for those class names. So it just has a big regex, and it looks in all the files you tell it to. If it finds any of those class names that it knows about, it puts that class name in the production CSS. I mean, it's genius. It's simple, but it's genius. So that means that your production CSS will only have exactly what it needs, and you'll never have any redundant CSS, which is the bane of any web developer. Is like you may have had a CSS class that you defined, and maybe you used it, but then that page got deleted or something, but you're afraid to delete it because you don't know if it's still used somewhere. And the only way to test it is to delete it and then test your entire site to see if anything breaks. I mean, that just seems so archaic, like to do it that way now, when Tailwind just makes it so elegant.
Question from Dwayne: where are the commands being run?
The commands to do the compilation and everything.
I think so.
Yeah, this is all done on your machine, so your development machine. This is something that you would do in a development type environment, right? This isn't something that you run on your live site. This is something that you do on your local host. This kind of goes back to, I've talked about this in other places, but people should be developing in a development environment and pushing that development environment to your live site. You should never be changing your live site live. At the very least, you should have a development server in the cloud. Even that I don't recommend. Have a local development environment. It's way easier. It's way more efficient. It's way safer. It's way more secure. It's faster. I mean, it's better in every way. There's no downside really. So you should be running this on your machine. So Node is basically running these commands, Node.js. So Node.js is doing the Tailwind command that's doing all the logic to actually build the CSS file with all the Tailwind classes you need. And then it's running the auto prefixer through post CSS, and it's running the CSS nano to compress the CSS. All that Node's running on your machine. And this should be done offline too. So this is something that you do during development, and then you push this minified production file to your production server. You're not doing any of this stuff at runtime.
Okay, Dwayne says he's using XAMPP. Would he need to install Node?
Well, you just go to Node.js website and you click the installation link, and there's I think a Windows installer. So it'll install as a program, like an exe on your machine. So then it'll just be available. But it's available on every platform.
Oh, and I think our final question takes us off on a bit of an angle. Question from David: is it possible to integrate Grav with Ionic Angular? I think he's looking to use Grav as the backend for a mobile app.
Yeah, it's possible. Like I mentioned, before, a Grav is not. It doesn't actually produce any output like the Grav core. So all the output is really done by the theme. So you can develop a theme to output in any format. We've actually built a fair amount of stuff with Vue.js. So we've put Vue.js on top of Grav with Twig templates, and that works great. So Grav is just sort of serving as the data store and handling content and configuration and things like that. And then how you output that, it's whatever you choose, and it can be anything on top of it: Angular, React, Vue, whatever. And if it's you can use whatever CSS framework you want. So or if it's a mobile app, it could be it could be using one of those mobile specific frameworks, or you could stick an API on top of it and you could just have a JSON being served. It's completely up to you. It's very flexible.
Okay, you've got some Grav fans here. Dwayne is asking for you to come back and do another session to show us Grav and the power of that. I think that's what you did last year, right?
Yeah, I think it probably was. It probably like an introduction to Grav. I've been thinking about doing more videos. I know people can absorb a little bit better sometimes with video. My only concern is they get out of date. so with every release, there's different things to say, but it's certainly possible to do another Grav one. Yeah,
people seem to take a YouTube channel as documentation when in fact it's more like a blog almost, that you release something and then it gets out of date within a couple of months. But
it's hard to keep up because you can't exactly go back and update the video to put in the changes, that may have happened in a more recent release. You basically have to do the video again, which is time consuming.
For people like us that do videos, it would be wonderful to be able to replace those YouTube videos with an updated version of the documentation. But I think the short version is you have a lot of Grav fans here who appreciate what you've done with Rocket Theme and with Grav as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I think just as much as any presentation that we've done in this conference, you've got a whole host of people saying, my mind is blown. Thank you. And giving their appreciation down in the chat for coming and talking with us today.
No problem. I'm glad to do it.
Andy,
Spread the Tailwind love.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andy.
All right. Thank you, guys.